Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how you can use Microsoft Excel to analyze a company's income statement. In this example I've downloaded Tilray Brands, which is a cannabis producer in Canada. I specifically used their statement here just because there's a lot going on, a lot of volatility, a lot of changes, got negatives and positives, so there's a lot to factor in here. So it's a good example just because you wouldn't want to use just one approach for analyzing an income statement. So I'm going to show you a couple ways that you can do so. I'm going to start with calculating a percent change, which is probably the most common. I mean, anytime you see a company release its earnings, it's usually by what percentage of revenue increased, profits decrease, or that sort of thing. And an easy way to do this is just take this current period value, divide it by the previous, and then subtract 1 to get the percent change. Now the one thing I'm going to do is add an if statement, because here you can see I've got a 0 value. So if I were to do this down here, I'm going to get the divide by 0 error, because obviously I can't divide by 0. So what I can do is you add an if statement here, select this value and say, okay, if this is equal to 0, then just set this to blank. So use double quotes, otherwise do the calculation as normal. And now it shows up as blank instead of giving me an error. So I can copy these formulas, and now I've got every line item showing a percent change. So the benefit of a percent change is you can easily see where there was a big jump. For instance, 128% in amortization, so it more than doubled from the same period last year. So this is a bit of abnormal, but the reason being this company made an acquisition in the past year, so it added more assets, it has more amortization, and so that's why their expenses are a lot higher than they were a year ago. So even 57% for general administrative. So a lot of change, a lot more personnel. So these percent changes help show that right away. Another thing you can do is using a dollar change. Like here, we've got an operating loss of 18%, so we've got a lot of losses on here. And in this one in particular, non-operating income and expense, we went from a negative to a positive. So minus 133% doesn't really conceptualize that change a whole lot. And this is where using a dollar change can be more effective. So take the current value and just subtract the prior year period's value, and now we can see that's a swing of $293 million. So that's a lot more significant than maybe just relying on 133%. So again, I can copy this down to the other values here. And now let's say this is dollar change. So as you can see, that 293 million, because these values are in thousands, that was the largest change on here. That wasn't a subtotal. Everything else was a lot more modest. Another thing we can do is look at percentage of revenue. I'm going to put that here as a merge field, because I want to put in the value from the current year, 2022, and the previous year. And so for percentage of revenue, I want to say, what percentage of the company's sales are eaten up by, cost of goods sold, selling costs, general administrative costs, right? So this is yet another way that you can communicate that information. So I'm going to skip over the net revenue line and start from where I've got my cost of goods sold. I'm going to take this value, divide it by the revenue. And what I want to do is freeze that first value. Oops. So what I'm going to do is freeze row 5 in this case. So I'm always dividing by that. And in this example, I'm not going to have that divide by 0 error just because my revenue's not 0. So I'm not going to run into that issue. So I don't have to make any if statement there. And I'm going to copy this over. Copy this over to the next year or the previous year. And now I can also do another change calculation. So let's see what the difference was from current year to the previous one. And so we can see that, this can be useful when you're analyzing margins. For example, gross profit, we can see it was 26% in 2022, 25% in the prior year period, so a change of about 1.6%. So we can look at the operating loss. It was 13% of revenue in 2022 and 19% in 2021. So we can see that it shrank as a percentage of revenue. So that's an overall a positive move. And you can obviously see that as well here in the positive change in the operating loss. It shrank from 24 billion to 19.8 million. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at this data and analyze it. And one thing that can be really useful is using conditional formatting. So this is a lot of numbers to look at, especially if you're looking at multiple statements or have a lot more data. And what you can do here is use conditional formatting. So let's say I select this entire field here for percent change. I'm going to conditional formatting and use color scales and something that goes from a green to a red potentially. And so right away you can see that the 128% increase in amortization stands out. The 133% increase in marketing and promotion stands out. And then the real big negatives also stand out. Now, the one problem with this is that these are subtotals, so these losses, these big changes are going to carry further down the statement, and you may not want to use percent changes in this case because if you have big increases or big changes, they're going to be captured up in here, and so doing them in the subtotals may be a bit redundant. And so what I'm going to do is wipe these out here because I don't want these affecting my conditional formatting. So I'm going to delete these. And now you can see my conditional formatting automatically updates because now these large negative changes aren't included in that. And so now my eyes, focus on, operating loss, which again is a subtotal, so I don't want to do that. And so now I can see the only negative on here above the operating loss line was a 5% reduction in transaction costs, which really isn't significant. But by changing what I'm applying the conditional formatting to, it makes it a whole lot easier to see that, there really weren't big reductions. And again, because the company got bigger, it incorporated another business, costs generally went up. So that's how you can use conditional formatting in this case to contrast the big changes with the smaller ones, and you can set up different types of rules. Like right now, it may seem a bit odd that we've got a 23% positive change showing up as red. So what we could do here is under conditional formatting. So going to more rules here, and I'm going to select a 3-color scale here to format all cells based on their values. I'm going to leave the lowest value being red, the highest value being green. What I'm going to change is this midpoint. Change this to a number and say if it's 0, I just want it to show up as white. And so the key importance of this is that as it moves from a positive down towards a 0, you can see the gradient changes from green to white and then transitions to red only when it's negative. So if I hit OK, now you'll see these 23%. This 23% change now shows a very faint green highlighting in here, just to show that it is positive, but it's not as large of a change as these values. So this is where you can adjust the conditional formatting besides just the default color scales, because it can be a bit misleading that looks red, so you're assuming that's a negative change, but that may not necessarily be the case. Another thing that can be useful when you're doing conditional formatting is here I've got percentage of revenue figures, and there's a lot of data on here. Again, I've got a fair bit of zeros. So what I can do is select these values and go to conditional formatting, and I'm going to create a new rule, and I'm going to use a formula, and my conditional formatting starts at cell I1. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to use the AND function and say, okay, if I1 is less than 0.01, so less than 1%, and I1 is also greater than minus 0.01%. So basically, if it's between negative 1% and positive 1%, what I want to do is ignore it. So I can format this, and under font, choose a very faint gray color, almost invisible. I want to still be able to see it, but basically I don't want my eyes to focus on that. So it helps the rest of the numbers stand out. And let's say I don't even focus on anything that's 5%. I can go back into my formatting rules, adjust this to, let's say, okay, plus or minus within negative and plus 5, I want to ignore. And so now it clears out even more items. So it's a lot easier to focus on just the bigger changes. And so that's another way where, it can easily draw our focus to the areas that made up a more significant portion of revenue. So conditional formatting can be an important way to analyze a company's income statement, as I've shown in a previous video, and combined with using percent changes and dollar changes and percentage of revenue, you can more efficiently review an income statement or any sort of earnings report from a company a lot easier than if you were to go line by line and try to do it, because using colors, using percentages or changes in absolute dollars can make it a bit easier to communicate these year-over-year changes and how the company did. So that's a quick overview on how you can use Excel to analyze a company's income statement.